This is me, driving to a cemetery in a local ghost town. You can see me outside now. Those of you who know me know that I do not do well with spooky things. I actually hate cemeteries a lot. They just don't do well with me. But here I am about to read the classic scary poem, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, in the middle of the night. But before I get started, let's take a look at this poem and how I got here in the first place.
Okay, so The Raven. We know that it's the Halloween classic by Edgar Allan Poe. So let's break it down a little bit and see why I chose to read it in this spooky season. This is Halloween when I'm filming this to celebrate. So some background. Edgar Allan Poe wrote this poem as his wife was dying of tuberculosis, which fits really well with the theme of the poem, even though it's so tragic, and I'm sorry for his loss and her pain. He was only paid $9 for it. It was the 1840s, but even then, it wasn't any money at all. So that being the case, when you're not making any money off your great art, you're sitting with the greats. So luckily for us, Edgar Allan Poe wrote an essay telling us exactly how he wrote The Raven. He called it The Art of Composition, and I've included a link to that in the description for this video. So, of course, after reading his essay, I decided to read the poem in a ghost town cemetery. That will be explained as we kind of go over his essay and his background and how he composed this piece of art, but it still wasn't my favorite thing in the world, and you'll see why. So, the composition process that Poe followed. Poe was against simple, spontaneous work. He says that poets usually try to say that they have this flash of inspiration, but he says it's never actually that way, which kind of hit me in the gut a little bit. He said that instead, we should create a theme and then an idea, refine it, and lay out how long we want the poem to be. Then establish our format, such as how many lines are going to be in it, our rhymes and our meters, and then make sure that it's still original. He says if it's not original, it's not worth anything. Then, after you've done all of that, you can begin writing. But he doesn't say to start writing from the beginning. Poe, for The Raven, actually wrote the climax first. He focused on where he wanted to get in all of that effort and then worked backwards to build the effect that he wanted to achieve. So I realize that this is quite the process, but it shows in this masterpiece. An example of why he should have done this is that originally he was thinking, okay, well, I want to talk about this melancholy brought on by the loss of beauty, which I think is the greatest thing that I could talk about in poetry. He was in the Romantic period after all. And so I want this man reflecting on it. Perhaps a talking animal can bring him to the brink of madness. What's a talking animal? I know, a parrot. And then he decided that a parrot wasn't spooky enough, so he switched to a raven, and we're all very thankful that he did. So let's talk about the format. So the whole poem is written in trochaic meter. So if you don't know what that means, that's okay. I'm going to talk about that next week in a more advanced video on language of meter and how we distinguish what a meter in a poem is and what that means. But your trochaic is basically the opposite of iambic. So iambic pentameter is usually what Shakespeare wrote in, where he did a soft syllable and then a strong syllable. Trochaic meters are the exact opposite of that, where you start with the strong and then go soft. So once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. That's something that drives the poem forward. So in this trochaic meter that Poe's using, he had a varying number of feet per line throughout the poem. So feet are just the pair of syllables. So once, pawn, those are 2 feet. Once, pawn, okay? So the lines also alternate between catalectic and catalectic. So what that basically means is whether or not he completes each foot in the line. So like he used a catalectic octameter, which basically meant he had 8 feet that were complete. He did not have a half foot that was left on. Then he also has other ones that he does leave that half foot at the end. So it kind of varies a little bit and kind of keeps our suspense going, which is really interesting that he chose a specific format for that. He also wanted to use something that really worked. And so what he decided was refrain works. I mean, refrain's been used forever. It's probably the oldest poetry technique. And so that being the case, it must be the best. So he decided on a very simple refrain to provide emphasis on his main idea of the poem. And this refrain was the word nevermore. That, of course, our parrot turned raven recites to us all, leaving us with kind of an eerie feel and wondering how depressed we should be. So something that he doesn't mention in his essay explicitly, but he does mention in that he wants to focus on the or sound in his assonance and in his rhymes, is sound symbolism and phonoaesthetics, which is really a field that's just starting out and emerging now, even though great writers forever have been using it. Borges used it in his work, Poe obviously used it, and it's still being used today. But researcher-wise, there's pretty much only Professor David Crystal in England, and from what he told me, he does not actually do any experimental work, just compiling. So phonoaesthetics and sound symbolism is when we take what we are listening to and we automatically associate it with some type of emotion. It's the idea that the way that sounds, how they feel to us, their aesthetic, affects the message we receive from those words. So a good example of this would be the names Dorath or Terran. Who do you think's the good guy? Well, you would think that Terran's the good guy most of the time, because Dorath just sounds like a bad guy for some reason. So Poe's phonoaesthetics is really in the nevermore, the or sound, which really makes sense as well, given that he was raised in Virginia and was probably speaking with somewhat of a southern drawl. So that or sound kind of comes out as like like a groan of loss and pain, which really just fits so well with the style. So now my takeaways before we get to the part that you're actually watching this video for, the clickbait of watching this guy read it in the cemetery. So inspiration plus preparation works. When you're writing something, when you're writing poetry, and that can be your marketing, that can be your Facebook post, that can be your resume, that can be whatever it is that you're writing. Poetry exists everywhere. Don't believe me? I'll talk about that later. Okay. Inspiration is great, a great idea. This was obviously a great idea Poe had. But when you match that with extreme preparation, like Poe's arguing, it's actually really good. And that's something that I need to apply better. Being the type of guy that was more, no, flash of inspiration hits me at 1 in the morning, I'm going to write it down, and then heaven forbid that I change it later. If I change it, then I have committed the cardinal sin against poetry. I cannot change my art. And I wrote a whole book of postmodern poetry based on the fact that I could not change what I'd written. But that's not the best way, apparently. And I am inclined to agree with Poe, even though it hurts. Another takeaway that I have is that Poe is more than just Gothic poetry. He's actually a literary critic, a playwright, and I can do a video on him later if you're interested in that. As of right now, I don't plan to, but we can try that. Another takeaway is that The Raven may be intended to be read by a Southerner, and that's what I will be awkwardly attempting at that cemetery. Some ways that I have of evidencing this claim and supporting my claim are that Poe puts different words in there that would rhyme if you spoke it with a Southern accent, such as on this land enchanted instead of enchanted, in this home by horror haunted, haunted, enchanted, or something at my window lattice. Let me see where that is. So when you slur your words with that drawl, you start to get a little bit better assonance and that rhyme that he was going in between each line. Okay. So now trochaic poetry drives the reader forward. We've already talked about this a little bit, but it was perfect for this spooky poem. And if you're writing something where you're trying to build up intensity, a poem in which you're trying to build up intensity for a slam, for a big reveal, or just for horror poetry, Gothic poetry, I cannot recommend trochaic meter enough. When you start with that strong and go with that soft, really good artists don't let us choose how we read it. They choose for us. And that's what trochaic poetry does. It really drives us forward and makes us keep going, building, 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 building towards that refrain, nevermore. So I'm not going to go into the whole symbolism behind everything in the poem this video. I can break that down another time if you'd like, maybe next Halloween if I can work up the courage to do this again. But let's get to what you're talking about here. The ghost town experience. So I went to a ghost mining town out in the middle of nowhere, and I read the poem 3 minutes faster than I'd ever rehearsed reading it. Part of this was because I kind of felt the midnight dreary that I was experiencing. And you'll see in the video, and I would love for someone to comment and explain this with science to me, because it was freaking me out a little bit as I was writing this and editing this video. You'll see floating lights start to appear next to me, and then some of them will start moving along the way. And so by the time I'd finished it 3 minutes fast and not as good of a performance as I should have given that I'd prepared to give, my apologies, but honestly, I was just ready to get out of there. So, without further ado, let's get down to the Ghost Town Cemetery.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, o'er many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had tried to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for that rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering long, I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the darkness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Then into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon I heard again the tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is someone at my window lattice. Let me see then where they're at us, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. If 'tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and fleur, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made here, not an instant stopped or stayed here, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is, up on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no sublunary being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered. So I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Wondering at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster." So when hope he would adjure, stern despair returned instead of sweet hope he dared adjure. That sad answer, "Nevermore." But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled the cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door, then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to Lincoln. Fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore with this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking, nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight glowed o'er, but whose velvet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from some unseen censer, swung by angels, whose faint footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Let me quaff this kind nepenthe and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, think of evil. Prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, by this home by horror haunted. Tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, think of evil. Prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven which bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul, if sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be thy word our sign of parting, bird or fiend! I shrieked up, starting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bustle of my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er her streaming shows his shadow on the floor. My soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.